What if the most dangerous moment in a relationship isn't when someone yells, but when they go quiet? When a person who once explained every feeling, softened every blow, and carried every emotional burden suddenly stops. No warnings, no fights, just a deep, unmistakable silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of clarity. That's when everything changes. Carl Jung believed that real transformation begins not with noise, but with withdrawal. Not with confrontation, but with inner reorganization. And for the empath, the one who has spent a lifetime over-functioning for others, this transformation often looks like nothing from the outside. They don't scream. They don't demand. They simply stop apologizing, stop justifying, stop trying to rescue the emotional world around them. They stop making themselves smaller just to keep the peace. To those who relied on their compliance, this shift feels like an earthquake. But to the empath, it feels like liberation. Because beneath that silence is something sacred, the birth of individuation. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, of withdrawing the projections of others and reclaiming the self. The empath doesn't rebel. They simply return back to their own voice, their own truth, their own boundaries. This isn't passive, it is powerful. It's the kind of quiet that reshapes entire dynamics, and for those who once benefited from their overgiving, it is often misunderstood as coldness or distance. But the truth is simpler and far more profound. They didn't change overnight. They just stopped explaining. This is the silent explosion they never expected, and it marks the beginning of a deeper, irreversible transformation. One that Jung would call not the end of connection, but the beginning of authentic existence. What if the pain you've been carrying isn't even yours? What if the exhaustion you feel at the end of every day is not from what you're doing, but from who you're holding? This is the hidden curse of the empath, not just feeling deeply, but unconsciously absorbing what others refuse to face. Maybe you were the child who soothed your anxious mother while your own fear went unnoticed. The spouse who always held space for your partner's moods while your own sadness went unspoken. The friend who became the late-night therapist, absorbing stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and shame, while silently disintegrating inside. You believed it was kindness. You thought it was love. But what if it was actually self-abandonment masked as loyalty? Carl Jung warned of this quiet tragedy. He saw how sensitive souls often serve as unknowing containers for the psychic shadow of others. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the unconscious part of the psyche that contains everything we reject, suppress, or disown: anger, grief, shame, inadequacy. Most people project this onto others rather than confronting it. And empaths, especially those still unaware of their energetic boundaries, become prime recipients. You weren't just kind. You were a psychic landfill for unresolved emotion. You became the emotional alchemist in every room, turning others' pain into temporary peace, at the cost of your own inner erosion. This isn't compassion. This is martyrdom disguised as empathy. And yet, because this dynamic is so unconscious, it hides in plain sight. The empath doesn't even realize what's happening until the signs of burnout appear. Chronic fatigue, silent resentment, a feeling of being constantly overwhelmed, even in supposedly calm moments. Emotional whiplash after spending time with certain people. That strange heaviness that follows you home from places where nothing happened. These are not just signs of stress. They are the psychic footprints of shadow material that was never yours to carry. Jung believed that if we do not become conscious of these dynamics, they will govern our lives and we will call it fate. So ask yourself, Have you confused love with emotional labor? Have you spent your life cleaning up messes that were never your own? How much of your identity has been shaped around being the strong one, the listener, the fixer, the healer, while silently disintegrating inside? The deeper truth is, no one is meant to be an emotional landfill. The empath's gift was never meant to be used in service of self-erasure. Your ability to feel deeply is sacred, but it was never meant to come at the cost of your wholeness. Jung taught that healing begins with awareness, and awareness starts with a powerful act of self-honesty. What am I carrying that is not mine? The moment you ask that question, you begin to return to yourself. This is where healing begins, not by hardening, not by blaming, but by choosing to see what's really been happening underneath your exhaustion. So tell me, what's the oldest emotion you're still carrying that was never truly yours? Who handed you their shadow and called it love? Let that question linger, because what comes next is not collapse, it's reclamation. What finally wakes an empath up? Is it betrayal? Is it abandonment? Or is it something quieter, the moment they realize they have betrayed themselves to protect everyone else? There's a shift that happens, not with screaming, not with drama, but with a kind of stillness that feels like thunder. One morning, the empath looks in the mirror and no longer sees the rescuer. They see the residue of 1,000 emotional compromises. They see the silent collapse that came from carrying other people's wounds like sacred relics. And something in them snaps, not in anger, but in clarity. You stop explaining why you're upset. You stop justifying why you feel drained around certain people. You stop negotiating your peace in exchange for temporary approval. Carl Jung called this moment the lifting of the veil. It is when the unconscious becomes conscious. Suddenly, the games you tolerated become visible. The manipulation you excused becomes undeniable. The stories you told yourself that if you just loved harder, if you just stayed a little longer, they would finally see your worth, shatter into dust. Maybe it's the spouse who always made you feel like you were too emotional, too needy, too much. Maybe it's the parent who only loved the obedient version of you, the one who smiled, achieved, and never asked for anything. Maybe it's the friend who disappeared the moment you had needs of your own. These patterns are not accidents. They are echoes of an old contract you didn't know you signed. I will carry your pain if you will just stay close. But the soul cannot live in a cage built from sacrifice. Jung believed that when we begin to see, truly see, the cost of our unconscious agreements, a transformation becomes inevitable. The empath doesn't rage, they detach. They don't try to fix anymore. They witness. The people around them, who once relied on their emotional labor, feel the shift instantly. Some will guilt you, some will accuse you of changing. But the truth is, you are returning. And that is the scariest thing for those who only knew how to love the version of you that served them. What does it mean to be clear instead of nice? What happens when love is no longer a performance but a boundary? Can you still be compassionate without being consumed? These are the questions that rise after the veil is lifted, and they are not easy questions, but they are the right ones. This is not the end of your sensitivity. It is the beginning of your sovereignty. So ask yourself quietly, have I mistaken peacekeeping for peace? Have I confused attachment with love? And most importantly, now that I see clearly, what am I finally ready to stop carrying? Because once an empath sees, they cannot unsee. And that vision, though painful, is the very key to their liberation. What if your greatest superpower was never meant to be silence, but discernment? There comes a moment when the empath, once a sponge for the emotions of others, undergoes a profound internal recalibration. They no longer absorb to survive. They observe to understand. They walk into a room and feel everything just as deeply. But now, instead of drowning in other people's energy, they start reading it. With every interaction, they recognize the subtle shift in someone's voice when they lie, the tension behind a polite smile, the unspoken desperation hidden inside a compliment. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition, and it was there all along. Only now it has awakened. Carl Jung called this inner skill active imagination. It's the bridge between intuition and consciousness. Before, the empath was submerged in emotional chaos, unsure of what was theirs and what wasn't. But now, they sit at the center of their inner world like a wise observer, watching every projection, every shadow, every manipulation rise and dissolve. They see through people not because they are jaded, but because they have seen enough. They no longer second-guess the sensation in their gut. They honor it. Take the example of a middle-aged woman who spent decades walking on eggshells around a narcissistic sibling. For years, she brushed off her exhaustion as stress, blamed herself for every argument, and kept the peace during every holiday dinner. But after years of inner work and spiritual exhaustion, she stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What am I allowing?" Suddenly, she noticed the tiny pauses before every guilt trip, the rehearsed tone before every apology, the energy shift before every emotional ambush. She didn't explode, she simply stopped responding the way they expected. That shift wasn't rebellion, it was mastery. The empath now becomes something others both crave and fear: a mirror, a person who cannot be fooled, a presence that makes the mask fall off. And that is exactly why some people will suddenly feel uneasy around them. They are no longer safe for projections. The old emotional contracts, the ones where the empath absorbed pain in exchange for closeness, are broken. But this isn't about revenge. It's about freedom. You still feel everything. But now you ask better questions. Why did their apology feel hollow? Why did I feel heavy after that conversation? What energy is moving through this moment that words are trying to cover? These are not just spiritual questions, they are survival tools. They are how you rewire the nervous system from trauma-based empathy into conscious perception. The truth is, you never lost your sensitivity, you refined it. What was once your burden becomes your compass. So ask yourself, what have I been feeling that no one is saying? What truth have I been sensing that others are too afraid to name? And more importantly, am I willing to trust my inner vision even when others deny what I know? Because when the empath becomes a lie detector, the world doesn't just look different, it feels different. And that clarity, when used with compassion, becomes the most powerful form of protection you'll ever have. What if the most radical act of self-defense was not to fight back, but to step out of the game entirely? For an empath, this is the turning point. For years, you may have been cast into roles you never auditioned for: the fixer, the peacemaker, the scapegoat. You defended yourself against accusations, explained yourself after being misunderstood, and tried to soothe the discomfort of people who projected their own shadows onto you. And yet, the more you tried to play fairly, the more the rules seemed to change against you. Jung taught that these cycles persist because they live in the unconscious, and as long as you unconsciously agree to play your role, the drama will repeat. The healing begins the moment you stop acting in a play that was never yours to begin with. Take the example of Sarah, a mid-level manager who constantly found herself targeted by an office manipulator. Every time she succeeded, This person questioned her competence in subtle, backhanded ways. For years, Sarah defended her record, explained her choices, and tried to win the approval of someone who had no interest in fairness. One day, she stopped. She no longer rushed to clarify or justify. She simply stated her boundaries and returned to her work. Suddenly, the manipulator's power dissolved. The fuel for their tactics, her attention and her emotional labor, was gone. Or consider Michael, who grew up with a mother who wielded guilt like a weapon. Whenever he set plans of his own, she responded with sighs, silence, or accusations of neglect. For decades, he gave in, abandoning his needs to maintain peace. But with age came clarity. He realized Jung's principle: what you do not make conscious will control you. He began to see the guilt trips for what they were, a projection of her own unhealed wounds. The day he calmly said, "I love you, but I will not carry this guilt anymore." The entire dynamic shifted. Her tactics unraveled, not because she changed, but because he stopped carrying what was never his. And then there is Lisa, who spent years in a relationship where her partner projected his insecurities onto her. He accused her of being untrustworthy whenever he felt restless within himself. He called her cold when she needed rest. He punished her for boundaries that were healthy. For years, Lisa explained herself, over and over, trying to prove her loyalty. But when she finally saw the pattern, saw it with Jung's clarity, she stopped trying to win a game built on illusion. She walked away. And in doing so, she collapsed the toxic system that had thrived only because of her participation. This is the hidden truth. The most terrifying thing you can do to a manipulator is not to shout, not to argue, not to match their chaos. It is to withdraw your role in the drama. Without your participation, the stage goes dark. The performance ends. So ask yourself, where in your life are you still explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you? Where are you still defending yourself against accusations that have nothing to do with you? And most importantly, what would happen if you simply stopped playing along? Because when the empath stops participating in unconscious games, they discover something astonishing. They are not powerless. They never were. Their silence is not weakness, it is clarity. And in that clarity, they reclaim the life they were always meant to live. What if the real reason you feel exhausted is not because you are weak, but because your soul has been bleeding energy into the wrong places for too long? Most empaths spend decades trying to be good. Good daughters, good sons, good spouses, good friends. But underneath the goodness often lies quiet exhaustion, spiritual depletion, and a deep sense of being invisible, even in the middle of their closest relationships. Why does this happen? Because they've spent their lives managing the emotional turbulence of others while burying their own storm. They've become the regulators of chaos, the emotional filters for dysfunctional dynamics. And Carl Jung warned us, what you deny in yourself becomes your shadow, and it will cost you everything until you face it. Take Diane, a 52-year-old woman who always prided herself on being helpful. She was the first to show up, the last to leave, and the one everyone leaned on in a crisis. But privately, she was unraveling. Her body developed chronic illness. Her marriage became a cold war of unspoken resentments. Her adult children saw her as a resource, not a human being. And yet, when asked how she felt, she would smile and say, "I'm fine." Until one night, standing in her kitchen, she dropped a glass, and something in her snapped, not in rage, but in silence. It was the moment Jung described as the return of the repressed. Her soul was no longer asking, it was demanding change. This is where Jung's empath method begins, not with blame, but with brutal clarity. His 5-step framework is not about fixing others. It's about finally facing yourself. Step 1, recognize the pattern. You must see the unconscious contract you've signed, that agreement to be the emotional caretaker in exchange for love, safety, or validation. Ask yourself, who did I have to become in order to feel accepted? And is that version even real? Step 2, integrate the shadow. Beneath your people-pleasing is buried anger, fear, and the suppressed right to say no. Jung said that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives and we'll call it fate. Your shadow is not evil. It is everything you had to repress to survive. What would happen if you let it speak? Step 3, stop the energy leak. Every time you over-explain yourself, rescue someone from consequences, or stay silent to avoid conflict, you are leaking life force. Empaths often think they are being kind, but often they are being drained. Your silence is not always peace. It can be self-betrayal. Step 4, embody authentic power. This step is not about dominance, but about embodiment. You begin to live from your inner compass, not outer approval. You stop molding yourself to fit broken systems and instead design a life that mirrors your soul. What if the most powerful thing you could be is fully, unapologetically yourself? Step 5, evolve the collective. The empath's awakening is never just personal, it is ancestral, it is generational. When you break your pattern, you give permission to others to do the same. Your boundaries are not selfish, they are sacred blueprints for others still trapped in emotional servitude. So, let me ask you, what if your healing was not a luxury, but a responsibility to the deeper story your soul is here to write? What if reclaiming your energy was the beginning of a revolution in your bloodline? You are not broken, you are awakening. And this method is not about improvement, it is about remembrance. You were never meant to carry the emotional weight of the world, but now that you see clearly, you can choose differently. And that choice is power. You're not too much. You're just no longer available for too little. Have you ever wondered why some empaths crumble under pressure while others rise in silence with unshakable grace? Why some people constantly attract emotional vampires while others walk into a room and shift its energy without saying a word? Carl Jung believed that there are levels to consciousness, and when applied to the empath's journey, it reveals 3 distinct phases, each marked by how awake you are to your own emotional power. Most people live and die in the first level, never realizing there is more to who they are than how much pain they can hold. Level 1 is the unconscious empath. This is the empath who believes their suffering is kindness. They think being emotionally drained is a sign of being loving. They are highly intuitive but unaware of it, often describing themselves as too sensitive or always overwhelmed. At this level, you attract wounded people like a magnet, not because you deserve pain, but because you have not yet discovered your worth. You confuse loyalty with self-abandonment. You allow love to become a form of erosion. And when someone hurts you, you don't ask, "Why did they do that?" You ask, "What did I do wrong?" That is how deeply programmed this level is. Level 2 is the awakening empath. Something breaks, hard. Maybe it was a divorce after decades of tolerating emotional neglect. Maybe it was the death of a parent, and you finally saw the generational trauma you were still carrying. Or maybe it was a moment as small as someone rolling their eyes when you finally spoke your truth. But whatever it was, it opened your eyes. At this stage, you start noticing patterns. You begin setting boundaries, though they often shake and wobble under guilt. You still feel everything, but now you begin to ask questions. Why do I always feel responsible for everyone else's emotions? You no longer believe that pain is your purpose. This level is uncomfortable. It feels lonely, but it is necessary, because here the empath meets their shadow, and that is where the real transformation begins. Level 3 is the sovereign empath. This is the empath who has stepped fully into their power. They are no longer emotionally available for chaos, blame, guilt, or breadcrumb love. They feel everything, but now they also choose what they respond to. They are neither avoidant nor reactive. They are rooted, calm, clear, and most importantly, conscious. This is not detachment, it is discernment. A sovereign empath can walk into a room, feel the tension, and still choose peace. They can hold space for others, but never abandon themselves in the process. They are protectors of their energy, stewards of their intuition, and carriers of deep generational wisdom. They do not explain their value, they embody it. Jung saw this process not just as emotional evolution, but as individuation, a sacred psychological unfolding. The goal was never to stop feeling. The goal was to feel consciously and to act from a place of wholeness rather than survival. So the question is, which level are you at right now? And more importantly, are you willing to move forward, even if it means leaving behind the version of you that was built on self-sacrifice? Let us know in the comments, when did you realize you were no longer an unconscious empath? What if the most radical form of power is walking away in silence, not out of defeat, not out of fear, but from a deep, irrevocable clarity that says, I will not offer my light where it is only used to cast shadows. For many empaths, especially those in midlife, this moment arrives after years of trying to explain themselves to people who were never listening, of offering softness to those who fed off it, of staying out of guilt, obligation, or the haunting fear of being alone. But there comes a moment when the ache of self-abandonment is heavier than the loneliness of walking away. And in that sacred rupture, something ancient and unshakable begins to awaken. Consider the single mother who stayed too long with a partner who belittled her dreams, drained her energy, and made her doubt her intuition because she feared what society would say if she raised her child alone. Or the middle-aged son who, despite a lifetime of emotional manipulation by his aging narcissistic parent, continues to visit every weekend, enduring the veiled guilt trips and biting sarcasm, afraid that walking away would make him a bad person. These are not small stories. They are common and quiet tragedies. And yet, within them lies the seed of profound liberation. Carl Jung believed that true transformation begins not with confrontation, but with separation. To walk away from someone who is feeding off your energy is not cruelty, it is clarity. Jung called this psychological non-violence, the refusal to continue energizing a system that thrives on your guilt, confusion, or over-explanation. When the empath stops explaining, stops rescuing, stops absorbing, they effectively dismantle the narcissistic loop. The abuser loses access to their supply, and that silence, that absence, it screams louder than any argument ever could. Why is it so hard, then, for the empath to walk away? Because on some unconscious level they still believe their worth is earned through sacrifice. But what if your greatest act of healing isn't saving others, but choosing yourself, fully and without apology? This is where the power shift happens, not in vengeance, not in public declarations, but in the still, quiet choice to no longer bleed for those who never intended to heal. Jung's wisdom reminds us, you don't need to fight them, you just need to stop feeding them. So here is the invitation for those reading this. What if your silence is your boundary? What if leaving is not loss, but resurrection? What if your peace is not something you must earn through suffering, but something you reclaim by refusing to suffer any longer? The world will try to convince you that leaving is weakness. But Carl Jung knew the truth. Walking away from what wounds you is the beginning of becoming whole. That is where your power lives, not in what you endure, but in what you no longer tolerate. What part of you still believes that love means staying even when it hurts? Let that be the question you finally answer. There comes a moment when the empath no longer seeks to prove their goodness or explain their pain. They simply step away, not in anger, not in fear, but in truth. The awakened empath doesn't fight to be seen anymore. They have already seen themselves, and that is the true liberation. In that stillness, they stop betraying themselves for the comfort of others. They stop negotiating with people who only respond to guilt, silence, or manipulation, and they stop sacrificing their own needs on the altar of someone else's chaos. Carl Jung called this inner shift psychological sovereignty, the sacred turning point where a person reclaims their energy from all the unconscious contracts they never agreed to. The empath doesn't become cruel or cold. In fact, they become more loving than ever. But now, that love has roots. It's no longer given as a survival strategy. It's no longer earned through emotional labor. It simply exists, whole, fierce, and uncompromising. This is not weakness. This is the strength that comes from having touched every dark corner within and no longer fearing the void. Because once an empath sees the truth, they can no longer pretend. They cannot be manipulated by stories that used to break them. They cannot be guilted by people who once fed on their empathy. They become, in the deepest sense, untouchable, not because they have hardened, but because they have awakened. The empath's final act is not revenge, it is self-possession. They stop over-explaining, they stop over-giving, they stop making themselves small so others can feel big. This is when the narcissist truly loses control. Not when the empath attacks, but when the empath simply no longer reacts. Silence becomes their shield. Presence becomes their boundary. And their light, once used to heal others, now protects their own sacred space. The journey ends here. Not with noise, but with clarity. The empath doesn't win by becoming someone else. They win by becoming fully themselves. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.